So as I was saying, instead of trying to give you very technical details about exactly what compromises the NSA put in cryptographic systems and exactly how they compromise the security of major companies that many of us use, like Google and Facebook, I instead want to try and kind of massively challenge everyone's thinking and energize and motivate you to work in the companies and the startups that you may find to build systems that are not able to be compromised in that manner. And the basic idea is, if you build systems in a way that is inherently secure and inaccessible to governments and hackers, you likely won't have major information disclosures and a subversion of your privacy. So why aren't we all building systems like that? And how do we build systems like that? And I just want to say that any views and opinions expressed during this presentation do not reflect my employer's views. This is me personally speaking about my experience as a consultant, as an independent consultant. So why wasn't I invited back after giving my last talk about computer security? This joke doesn't go over so well in the United States because I don't think they quite get it, but this is a very famous Russian painting of an older woman standing in front of a dark forest, and there's two paths you can go down, and both of them look pretty dark and imposing and not places you really want to go. This is basically how I view computer security. I'm a bit of a pessimist, and when the Snowden revelations first came out and I spoke at some of the local groups at MIT and around the United States about what they meant and how they impacted security and how long those vulnerabilities likely existed, it was a pretty dark time, and I felt very defeated and felt like we are never going to get our system secure again, and this is just an insurmountable task. And the intelligence community tends to be in the United States about 10 to 15 years ahead of the hacker community. So if the NSA is able to compromise all this infrastructure of these companies that are really leading the world in computer security and computer security processes, what is the world going to be like in 10 or 15 years when these capabilities are out in the everyday world? So what exactly did Snowden and others reveal? Because there's been a number of leaks after Snowden, particularly through WikiLeaks, about not just the NSA, but also the Central Intelligence Agency constructed essentially a parallel NSA with, in some ways, equivalent capabilities in terms of compromises. And what we learned is that any unencrypted communications are intercepted and stored. All international fiber optic links are tapped. Links between data centers are tapped. Many companies like Google were transmitting data between data centers unencrypted on proprietary network lines that they were leasing from major telcos that they thought were secure. And they did find that those were, in fact, intercepted. I remember when the Snowden leaks first came out, a reporter had tweeted out that the content the NSA got looked like a screen capture from someone accessing Gmail. And I wrote that reporter back at the Washington Post, and I said, no way, that's not possible. You just don't understand the systems and the cryptography and the mathematics involved. There's no way. But we came to find out that, in fact, it was possible, and that's exactly what they had. So how did they do that? Well, the cryptographic standards and the systems have all been subverted. Things like the dual elliptic curve random number generator, for example, they were able to produce invalid random data, which led to invalid keys that were easy to attack. Uncompromised cryptographic systems are attacked directly. So a very famous attack was the SIM card attack here in Europe. What happened was there's one company that manufactures most SIM cards under contract for most providers. They were able to break into that system and steal the database of encryption keys that were encoded into the SIM cards. And then when your telephone talked to a tower and announced its SIM ID number, they were able to map that back to the decryption key for your SIM card. So systems and networks are attacked directly. Not just SIM cards and phone systems and computer systems that store sensitive data, but network switches are attacked and used to redirect traffic to other locations where it can be analyzed. The US government works very closely with vendors. Microsoft is probably a primary example. Cisco. Data is collected and warehoused on everyone indefinitely. So the amount of storage growth at the NSA has been estimated based on the amount of electricity they use and the amount of square footage and cooling capability their data centers have. And it's in the many, many hundreds of petabytes. It's absolutely huge. And they also have a large cache of hacking tools and vulnerabilities. So any system that you're running, any piece of software, they likely have a tool that can break into it, and they likely have a secret vulnerability in the system that will let them do it. And if you look at their hacking tools, the code doesn't look that great when you look at it. It's Perl code. It's not exactly very clean or very efficient and fast. But when you think about it, what's incredible about this code is it's very cross-platform. This Perl code can run pretty much anywhere, on any platform, on any system, and work as expected and extract data or compromise systems for them. So Snowden showed us how bad things are. The United States government has made cyber capability a priority, and what that means is we borrow billions and billions of dollars from the Chinese and spend it on whatever we consider a priority. So that, at this time, is subverting open standards, cryptographic protocols, purchasing vulnerabilities, and perhaps creating and introducing them. So perhaps participating in open source projects, and even placing employees in companies that develop closed source software. I can tell you, I looked at some of the vulnerabilities in OpenSSL, and when you go and look at the code that these NSA vulnerabilities attack, it's very surprising. It's like, how could anyone make that mistake unless it was, you know, maybe intentional or induced somehow? Very like low-level kind of early university programming errors that you figure a professional programmer would not make. So the U.S. has a large U.S. dollars in the billions budget for offensive research. They're developing new attacks every day. They're continually analyzing the software and infrastructure we use. They have incredible capabilities to reverse engineer things like Cisco switches, Cisco routers that we all depend on. And there's evidence of the use of cyber attacks in international disputes, things like Stuxnet, and there's rumors out there that the North Korean missile failures were driven by US cyber initiatives. But basically what's concerning to me, and I think most people, is we have an untargeted dragnet that just scoops up all information on everyone. And what's driving that is this panicked fear in US law enforcement, I believe, that they'll miss the next big attack. They don't want to be the person who missed the next 9/11. So the primary source of US intelligence is now cyber capabilities. And there's discussions that even the capability to do normal human intelligence gathering is becoming very diminished because not only the US, but all governments are becoming so dependent on cyber capabilities. General Michael Hayden, who's been one of the strongest advocates for the ability to collect kind of everything, to collect all cyber data and communications, is famously quoted as saying that right now we're at the golden age of intelligence. And what's driving that is widespread adoption of cell phones and social media by people. You think about military capabilities when you're trying to find someone or target them. They have the ability to locate a cell phone anywhere in the world. You're basically carrying around a GPS tracking device for them, and they're able to intercept not only your phone calls, but all data also passing through your cell phones. One of the biggest, most valuable data collections that comes through cell phones is Google Maps data, believe it or not. So in addition to that, not just data that we're kind of using on the internet or transmitting across the internet, but global corporations have also pivoted to big data. The McDonald's down the street is suddenly very interested in the fact that you maybe buy a hamburger every day at 6:35 on Tuesday afternoon. And all that data that they're collecting, putting in their databases, is eventually swept up and included in the data that is analyzed. So NSA's state actor capabilities versus other hackers is something that's important to look at. Due to the legal support and massive budget that NSA and other state actors will have, they'll always be in their own class. And that's important to us because what we want to try and defend against is the kind of progression of NSA capabilities down to criminals and general individuals who are hacking. Some things that the NSA is capable of and that a state actor would be capable of will not eventually trickle down, so we don't need to worry as much. For example, telecommunications intercept, tapping a fiber optic cable, telecommunications injections. So this would be if you have a TCP session that's going across a fiber optic cable and it's going through a compromised router or switch, the ability to inject packets into that TCP session. And I've actually seen this once myself when I was at MIT. We accidentally posted on a web server some of the design plans for a Predator drone. And there was one IP in Iran that was trying to download these essentially schematic drawings and pictures of the drone internals. And the HTTPS sessions kept hanging up in the middle of the download. They'd always get a partial download. And I was writing my kind of incident report about this, about who accessed this data we shouldn't have posted, and review, information about all the IPs who accessed it. And only this Iranian IP was having a problem. Like Google Robot, able to download it no problem. Everyone else. And what it looked like to me at the time was an injection of a hang-up in the HTTPS download stream. And several months, maybe a year or two after that, I read about the injection capabilities through the Snowden leaks. So a lot of this stuff is real, and a lot of us have probably seen it. We just didn't really recognize it at the time. I mean, that very easily could have been just a bad fiber optic link somewhere in Iran. So cryptographic infrastructure subversion is also something that's probably beyond the capabilities of your average hacker or even your average criminal organization. Certainly, there are people out there with the capability to do it, but in general, there's easier ways to gain access to information. So in terms of what their capabilities are in terms of hacking and compromise of systems, the NSA and the CIA and other state actors are really using just traditional methods, already the same methods that hackers use. Primarily, it's buffer overflows. There are some more advanced capabilities out there, like algorithmic cryptographic system compromise. The most famous of these was SSH sessions that were initiated with Diffie-Hellman key negotiation were broken by a system called Poison Nut. And what Poison Nut was the generation of primitives for Diffie-Hellman prime numbers in a field that the cryptographic operations for key generation operated over, and the storage of those essentially in hardware devices in the NSA that allowed extremely fast computations of the key negotiations in order to break the cryptography and expose the SSH session keys. So if you were SSHing from, say your home computer to your work computer and you thought, oh, this is encrypted, there's no way someone could pull a password out of this, Poison Nut let the NSA pull whatever password you put in your SSH session right out of it. Now the scary thing that's happening in the last few years is that these tools and techniques are starting to leak. We saw a major leak from the CIA of all of their tools into WikiLeaks, and they included source code vulnerabilities. We've also seen leaks from the NSA tools, and while we patch these in software when we find out about them, there's a huge number of them, and then the tools and techniques can be expanded and extrapolated to new vulnerabilities as they're discovered. And these aren't just small pieces of code that can compromise a piece of software. These are command and control systems, toolkits, the capability of redirecting certain web clients to systems specifically designed to compromise the web servers running on those computers. But we're getting better, right? I mean, we've patched a lot of the holes that the NSA leaks have shown and that the CIA has shown through their leaks. Well, one of the ways that we thought we were getting better that I'm going to talk about very quickly here is virtualization. And the idea of virtualization and compartmentalization is that if you kind of separate every process and every system into its own system image into its unique operating system environment, compromises can be somewhat contained. Initially, we were talking about virtualization and dynamic memory environments as a solution to a lot of the compromises that happened, specifically buffer overflows. I remember when Java first came out, everyone thought that buffer overflows were over. No one was going to be able to break into a system written in Java. There was just not going to be any security vulnerabilities. And anyone who's a system administrator knows that every week you have to patch Java because there's at least 100 new vulnerabilities in Java. It just didn't work out the way people expected. Virtual machines, operating system images are also helpful, as are containers, which are just essentially the virtualization of applications without virtualizing an entire operating system to run them. So you have an operating system layer and an application layer. A virtual machine virtualizes all of that from the operating system up. A container only virtualizes down to the application. And we've also been experimenting with virtualization in networks. Virtual private networks, encrypted links that should be impenetrable to people, although we found that there are ways to break into those from the NSA publications. And VLANs, virtual, essentially, local area networks controlled by, say, Cisco switches. But no matter how much we isolate things and separate them into separate containers to try and prevent compromises from expanding beyond them, the systems still need to talk to each other. We need to be able to speak from our web server to our database server to our authentication server. And it's in these communication links that compromises happen. And these systems are somewhat more secure, but entire new classes of attacks have emerged to deal with these attempts to try and secure things. We've got now hypervisor attacks, which are attacks in virtual machines against the hypervisor or the low-level bare metal operating system they run on, and the ability to essentially transverse through the hypervisor in ways we should not be able to either observe other virtual machines and capture encryption keys, or to actually break into other virtual machines running on the same hardware. Now, obviously, with most companies moving toward systems like AWS, Amazon Web Services, that are based on virtual machines and virtualization, it's a major problem if anyone can boot up a virtual machine on the same piece of physical hardware as you and somehow manage to break into your server. So the engineering lesson, I think, here is we cannot stop them. We cannot stop hackers. We need to engineer our systems with the expectation that they're going to be hacked and they're going to be penetrated. 30 years ago, when I first started with computers, very early, the means of hacking were buffer overflows, off-by-one errors, another type of memory programming error, and SQL injection was extremely common. 20 years ago, it was the same thing. 10 years ago, the same thing. Today, I just patched a couple weeks ago a bunch of buffer overflows on servers. It's the same thing today. And tomorrow, I expect it'll be the exact same thing, no matter what new technologies are kind of emerging. It's just there's fundamental truths in the design of computers and computer chips that lend themselves to these kind of attacks. So I know some people are thinking, well, I've been studying computer security, and I can tell you I know how to fix buffer overflows now, and I know how to fix things, and we're not going to see these same errors. We're educating people. We're going to these conferences. We're learning about them. But no, we really cannot stop the hackers. Like, seriously, we cannot stop them. Everyone remembers Heartbleed, I think, which was extremely, extremely bad vulnerability in OpenSSH, and almost no one was protected from Heartbleed. Maybe there was a couple of active firewalls out there, one or two of the really high-end vendors that was able to filter Heartbleed-type attacks, but they were able to compromise OpenBSD with Heartbleed. Heartbleed was actually inside OpenBSD, which is very disheartening to a lot of people because OpenBSD is really the best of the best when it comes to security. And that they couldn't even stop this vulnerability from appearing in OpenBSD and existing there for some time is a good example of exactly how difficult it is to protect against this kind of stuff. And the thing is even if we can find these vulnerabilities, like we're doing better with automated scanners and software to disassemble commercial software and look for vulnerabilities, zero-day bugs can exist for years before discovery. There's new ones being written into software every day. So one study that I'll point out found that Linux kernel bugs takes an average of 857 days after discovery to be fixed. So that's 3 years, essentially, of vulnerability. Same study found that Windows Core OS bugs, bugs in the actual operating system kernel of Windows, 375 days after discovery to be patched. So more than a year. That's a lot of time to have your systems exposed and not be able to do anything about it. These bugs can exist for even decades before discovery and repair. One famous example is a bug in the Linux kernel that was exploitable, a security flaw that went on for 11 years without being discovered and repaired. So aside from just the difficulty of finding these bugs and fixing these bugs, even in an environment where you're paying high-quality professional programmers like Microsoft, patching can be impossible or extremely difficult for end users. A big hack in the news right now in the United States is Equifax. Equifax was hacked by a bug in Apache Struts. And the problem with the Apache Struts bug is that you couldn't just patch it by downloading a new version of Struts and deploying it. You had to actually rewrite a lot of your code. It was probably a month or more long process to work through all the programming required to patch that bug. And Equifax did not have the patch done before they were hacked and essentially leaked their entire database of every single person in the United States old enough to have any kind of credit record and their social security number and banking details. Unmaintained open source projects and software is another huge area where people are able to get into systems. If there's a bug in an open source software package and it's reported to a maintainer who's not checking his email anymore, there's just no path to escalate that. And there's no way for people who run that software to know that there's even been a bug reported or that there's a need to address a really critical security issue. And this study was by TrustWave, and I have a graph just to show. You can see the Linux kernel there at the top about how long it takes average to patch a vulnerability. This was in 2012, so things have actually gotten a lot worse since 2012. There's a lot more vulnerabilities, and there's just, I think, even more of a lag on getting a lot of them patched. You'll notice that it's the Linux kernel, which is most servers and most Android phones, Microsoft Windows, which is most desktops, and then Cisco iOS, so most internet core routers and switches, and then PHP, WordPress, and OpenSSL. PHP, of course, is behind a lot of web applications that store personal data. WordPress is a very popular blogging platform. OpenSSL is the cryptography in the SSH protocol, and it also powers a lot of the HTTPS traffic on the internet. And finally, right below that is bind, or DNS traffic. So those are really all the critical pieces of internet infrastructure. They touch almost everything, and they're all at the top in terms of number of vulnerabilities, and at the top in terms of the amount of time it takes to patch them. So what should we do? Well, this is kind of a question that I've been thinking a lot about working in consulting with companies like Proton Mail. And the answers I've come up with are based around the idea that if you can't trust your infrastructure to keep your data safe, you shouldn't trust your infrastructure with your data. So encrypt valuable data. Don't store anything unencrypted in a service, in a database. Aggressively limit account privileges. When you write software, limit what the accounts that you create as part of that software's workflow can actually do. Limit what you store. Eliminate single points of system failure. Metrics on everything so that you're aware of what's going on in your system. And of course, keep backups so that if you do get attacked and you get hit with ransomware, you're able to deal with it effectively. So encrypt valuable data. I mean, this is the core thing I want to touch on because this is a major kind of transition in the way people think about writing web applications, building startup companies, and storing data on the internet. Most often, attackers are after your data. They're not there to infect your customers with viruses or software to turn their computers into botnets for DDoSes. It's just not necessary anymore. They want the data. They want to sell it. If it's identity data, financial data, or ransom it to avoid embarrassing the company. Equifax is a really good example of this, as is Sony, where they offered to sell the data back to the company for ransom in Bitcoin. Email, text, photo leaks, again, because they can be embarrassing. They hold a lot of personal information. Sony's the most famous hack that really had a huge impact on a major US company that operates worldwide. A lot of American celebrities and UK celebrities have had their email and their text messages and things attacked and offered for ransom. And finally, industrial espionage is a huge problem, especially in the United States. The big 5 defense contractors are frequently attacked for data on their network. Oracle, historically, was attacked in order to gain the source code behind the Oracle database. And Oracle tried to spin that like, well, our database system is so good and so fast, you want our software so you can duplicate it and violate our patents. But if I had to guess why they wanted to steal Oracle source code, it would be because they were looking for buffer overflows and other security vulnerabilities in the Oracle software itself so they could attack Oracle installations and exfiltrate their data. Akamai also had a famous hacking attack by an inside person, an employee of theirs, who tried to steal their data. And several US hedge funds have had major attacks where they've lost data about their trading policies and software that drives quantitative trading of stocks and things like that. Of course, if you lose that kind of software, it's a major problem because people are able to predict what you'll do in the stock market. So companies still aren't encrypting their data yet. Some large companies are just starting now to do encryption of data at rest. And what that means is like encrypted hard drives, for example, requiring all your employees to encrypt their hard drives, encrypting your server's hard drives, so that if you lose a computer or you're not using data, it's just stored on backup tape or backup hard drives, or in the cloud, for example, it's safely encrypted to the point where it can't be broken even if it is stolen. But I recommend going beyond that, a step beyond that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. I do want to point out that encryption can be very hard. I've seen a lot of people fail to implement encryption properly, and most often where they fail is the storage of passwords in their databases. So the way passwords are stored is you take the password a user sends you, and you produce something called a hash, which is a derivative of that password. Now, if you just hash the password, if you just take this password and convert it into a hash with an algorithm like MD5 or SHA-1, and store that hash, it's very easy to do a reversal of that hash by brute forcing a dictionary of words and computing their hashes. So the way that people typically deal with that is by doing what's called salting the hash. You take a random value and append it to the password that the user sends you, and then you hash the random value with the password. Since the attacker doesn't know the random value, they have a much, much computationally harder problem to get passwords out. One of the most famous hacks where people screwed up the password storage algorithm was LinkedIn. And the LinkedIn database has been circulating the web for, I think, more than 8 years now. But still, we frequently get users who are compromised because they're using the same password they used at LinkedIn. And LinkedIn did not encrypt the password strongly enough so that people could not determine what they were. If you're using the same password and the same email address that you're using at LinkedIn to register for another site, there's definitely going to be a hacker that's going to log into that account at some point. So, like I said, I think we should go a step farther than just encrypting data at rest. We don't want to let our compromise of our infrastructure, be our customers' compromise. So we should be able to lose systems to hackers without losing the data stored on those systems. And encryption is hard, but it doesn't have to be difficult because there's really amazing open source toolkits out there now that are available. For example, ProtonMail uses OpenPGP.js as an example. There's PGP libraries. There's various SSL implementations. There's GNUPG and several reference implementations of AES and other algorithms. So as long as you follow the RFCs describing the encryption protocols and you use software that other people have tested, it's pretty hard to screw up encryption. It's only when you try and roll your own software or you're just not careful about your implementation that you run into really severe problems. So what are encryption best practices? For an okay level of system, you know, a decently safe system, I think Encryption with company-controlled keys, you know, AES 128, 56, ECC, RSA, is pretty much what we've had the last 10 years, and it's not that bad. You have to remember that before Snowden, everyone was transmitting a lot of data in plain text over the internet. But a company-controlled key would be like a web certificate. So a TLS web certificate with a private and a public key. If that key is lost, all the data transmitted through that server is compromised unless that server is upgraded to a recent version of TLS that uses something called perfect forward security, which basically means encryption for HTTPS that generates a new random key for each session for each user. So not only do we want to store data encrypted and use a company-controlled key, but we also want to make sure that all of our data is encrypted during transit with one of these modern versions of TLS. One-way hashing of unneeded data is very necessary, and it's something that almost no one does. So a lot of sites use what I would call SMS verification or text message verification. And when you do that, you essentially get a unique phone number and use that to identify a user. And that's how you prevent essentially spammers from setting up thousands of accounts is you require them to have a SIM card or a phone number. And in order to get a SIM card or a phone number, you typically have to show an ID in the European Union or the United States. So there's essentially a mechanism to prevent uncontrolled signups of accounts. Now, what a lot of people do is they store the phone number unencrypted in their database, and they map that back to an email address and a username. And the problem with that is that the phone number is like the primary selector, the primary key in the data that the NSA stores on people and that hackers use to track people. So do you really need someone's phone number? If you're planning to call them for tech support, you can ask them for their phone number through tech support, or you can use a chat or something else. So what you can do with a phone number is you can compute a hash of the phone number and store that. If you compute a hash with, again, a salt, a random value, and a phone number and store that in your database, it's impossible for someone who compromises your database to find out everyone's phone number that is registered for your service. And that doesn't sound extremely important, but keep in mind that most two-factor authentication right now is done with phone numbers. And it is possible to essentially spoof a phone number and therefore bypass two-factor authentication by working with the transfer system associated with transferring phones between telephone companies. So OK is just the company's in control of the key. They're in control of the encryption of the data. If they do everything right, you're pretty safe. But we can do better than that. We could do a good system where the data encryption with company-managed, customer-controlled keys is done. And what that is like an escrow system. It means that the company manages the keys in their database so that you can access the company's website through either a phone or a web browser or other mechanism. But the company does have a key that you only have access to, and the way that's handled is with a type of encryption called string-to-key encryption, and it's the use of a password, essentially, to encrypt an encryption key, which is then stored in a company database. This would allow you to do things like account recovery if you need to, rotating keys when you pass key life, and it allows you to have something to turn over to the government of your jurisdiction if you're required to. So if we do that kind of encryption, all of a sudden if a hacker breaks into our system, they can get encrypted keys, but they have to run a dictionary attack to try and get access to those keys. It's much more time intensive, it's much more difficult, and if you pick a good password, they may never get access to your key and your data. Obviously that's much better than a system where there's just one key for the company, and if a hacker gets access to that key, they can decrypt, say, data at rest or data stored in the database. So again, we want to do encryption of all data during transit with perfect forward security, TLS 1.2 or 1.3, and one-way hashing of unneeded data, things like phone numbers, email addresses that we want to store, but we don't ever really need to access other than just to verify that we've received them. Now, a great system, the best way to design one of these systems, the data encryption is customer-controlled keys, period. The keys only exist on the customer devices, on the customer's phone, on the customer's computer, and the customer's encrypted those keys with a password. The company has no ability to access the keys whatsoever, encrypted or unencrypted. Now, if you have that type of system, the most you'll ever be able to hand over to a hacker if they take over your system, or even law enforcement, if law enforcement serves you with a warrant, is the encrypted data, encrypted with the customer's key that you don't have access to. So you have to tell law enforcement you need to go and serve a warrant to the customer. And the hacker will essentially be out of luck. They'll be doing a brute force attack to try and break the encryption. And if you're using modern encryption, there's basically zero probability of that. At least now. Encryption algorithms have been shown to weaken over time, but probably with current algorithms, we're looking at 40 or 50 years before they're tractable, just due to limitations on the size of microchips and the laws of physics. So again, encryption during transit with perfect forward security. If you're running systems right now, this is like the one thing I'd encourage you to do when you go back to your desk at work, is make sure you're running the most recent version of TLS and you're using an algorithm with perfect forward security. And then again, one-way hashing of unneeded data. So another thing we want to do is aggressively limit account privileges. SQL dumps are the most common way for compromised data to circulate. We've all seen leaks from companies like Patreon or LinkedIn or Ashley Madison or a number of other companies, and that data is almost always a dump from MySQL, essentially a backup dump that you can then load into a local database and look through. To prevent SQL dumps, you want to have very granular role accounts. So you'd have a separate database account for authentication that can only access the authentication table, meaning the username and the password, and the two-factor authentication. And you want to have a separate account just for metadata. For example, if your mail system is receiving mail, you want your mail system only to be able to read from the database the names and email addresses of people it's allowed to receive mail for. You don't want it to actually be able to go back through old messages. And then finally, you have your most privileged customer account, most privileged SQL accounts that can access the database and actually bring down customer data. You want to try and contain those and use them as infrequently as possible in your source code. So shell accounts are always a huge danger. Another way that people tend to get in is compromised shell scripts or stolen passwords because people were using passwords, for example, from like LinkedIn. So you want to avoid sharing the root account at all because it doesn't create an audit trail, and root has a lot of system privileges. So you want to create role accounts. You want an account for mail. If you have a program that does things like SMS notifications, you want an SMS account that has very limited access. And you want to use sudo to run commands within those accounts. You don't want people just logging into those accounts and with, say, SSH keys and then running commands locally. And whenever possible, you want to avoid shell scripts. You want to write binary programs to do, say, the type of database maintenance or database clearing that you might need, or disk clearing or things like that, because shell scripts have their own set of security concerns and their ability to interact with environment variables that are completely missing from binary programs. The less code that you have running, the better. If you write a small, simple binary program, you can be pretty confident that it's going to be difficult to abuse that program because there's so little code there, and you're familiar with all the code. So database accounts and application accounts should also be limited. So this is stuff within your own application. It's the principle of least privilege. Never give an account more access than it needs. It absolutely needs to do what you want it to do. And always be reviewing your accounts and looking at your accounts and your application design, your infrastructure design, to see if you can separate one account into multiple accounts. You want to limit database account privileges whenever possible to the least possible. So WordPress, for example, there's been tens or hundreds of thousands of WordPress sites compromised. And the main problem is that WordPress has one database account that has read and write capability. So whenever somebody accesses a blog through a script that should just be able to read the database and display the contents, they also have write access. And people have used that write access to do everything from inject ads into the WordPress blog that don't belong there, to inject viruses into the blog, to change the contents of the blog. And internally in your own applications, it's important to use these same principles because it's not just WordPress that falls to these kind of attacks. They're very common. There's software toolkits that scan for these type of attacks, and they check locally developed applications just as efficiently and as effectively as they check an application like WordPress. So limit what you store and collect. I mean, this is a really important point that kind of goes against the way things currently work in the IT world. Right now, the paradigm is collect everything you possibly can because you might be able to use it for advertising or you might be able to sell it. If you don't have the data, though, hackers will not come for it. And if you don't have it to have the hackers take it, they're not going to try and ransom it back to you, and you're not going to wind up in the press with an embarrassing story about how you lost people's personal communications on a dating site or their personal medical history, those kind of things. So you want to avoid storing any personal data whenever possible. So like I was talking about before, if you're doing SMS verifications, store a salted hash of the phone number to verify that it's been used. Don't actually store the phone number itself. Use a third-party vendor when possible if you don't have a strong security team at your company, or if you're not 100% confident in your ability to protect sensitive data like credit card numbers, bank account details. There's plenty of companies. PayPal is the most well-known one, but there's literally hundreds of them that will handle all financial transactions for you, relieving you of having to store that kind of sensitive data that might attract hackers. Aggressively expire data when you no longer need it. This is a key thing that's gotten a lot of companies in trouble. Ashley Madison most famously, when people had deleted their account and they thought wiped all their data and communications off their server, they left the data in their database under the assumption that they'd be able to use it later or sell it to someone later. And it's a huge problem because you're essentially promising the customer you're erasing their content, their personal information, and you're not. I mean, Facebook is another company that's famous for this. You click delete and you think you're deleting a Facebook post, but you're just marking a little flag in their database that says don't display this. Ukraine has some new hacking laws making some computer crimes an issue now that weren't some years ago. I think the next thing after computer crime related laws is going to be liability laws for things like personal data, financial data. It's going to come because it came in the United States very quickly, and what drives it is a major compromise that affects a lot of people and gets them angry and talking to their representatives. So when you do store data, if you absolutely have to store it, if it's critical to your business, to your process, you should encrypt it. Symmetric key encryption with the key stored inside the code, so just literally just putting a key inside your source code is okay. That's better than nothing. It's much better than what most companies out there are doing right now. Most companies are not using any encryption in their databases. Symmetric encryption with the key stored in protected RAM, protected file, or an HSM, hardware security manager, is even better. That's great. That's like the top tier of what most companies are doing out there right now. But the absolute best way to store private customer data that you need to retain for some reason is to encrypt it with a public-private key pair. So you encrypt the customer's data with a public key that can sit on your server, and you maintain the private key offline. If you ever need to access that data, say for tax purposes or accounting purposes or reporting purposes at the end of a quarter, you then decrypt that data in a safe location and delete it when you're done running your auditing on it. So you want to eliminate single points of security failure. No single compromise to any piece of software or any system should compromise your entire infrastructure. Firewall and VPN isolation is super important. You'd be amazed how many companies out there do not have adequate firewalls and are not using VPNs to protect the traffic and communications that are flowing through their network. Be especially careful when you're deploying DevOps solutions, because DevOps right now typically involves an account that has absolute privilege over all the systems that you're deploying code to, and that's just a recipe for disaster. As soon as your deployment system in your DevOps model is compromised, all of your systems are compromised. So you need to engineer that in a way where you've at least segmented production from development and test, and production should be even further segmented so that deploys cannot compromise all of your production systems at the same time. And finally, just to kind of repeat on this, always use different authentication credentials, different passwords, different two-factor primitives, et cetera, on every single system. You don't want someone to gain access to one system and be able to use the same credentials to authenticate to another system. Full access is very efficient. Programmers love it because it makes their job easy, and sysadmins love it because it makes it very quick to troubleshoot problems. But efficiency, when you're doing that kind of optimization of just giving people a lot of access very quickly, is very dangerous because it only takes one compromise to essentially compromise everything. So a key point I want to talk on here too that most people are just starting to do at their companies is monitoring and metrics. And metrics is the most important part of this. The state of the art right now in monitoring and metrics is the kind of systems you would find at like the big 5 defense contractors, the military companies in the United States. They actually have systems that monitor all TCP/IP connections on their networks and all traffic on their networks. And if the system sees anything out of the ordinary, that it doesn't, that really concerns the security, integrity of the system, it'll actually shut off whole portions of the network. If they think a system's compromised and it's transmitting data out of the network that it shouldn't, that system will lose its connection at the switch. So if a system is like using more bandwidth than it should and is like 2 standard deviations ahead of the bandwidth it normally uses, that system's shut off, and that person will have to file a ticket with the help desk saying, why did you shut off my system? If, in fact, the system wasn't compromised. So that's a few years away from startups. There's no good open source software out there right now that does that you can deploy. For right now, for startups, the best practice is monitoring and metrics, but that you do yourself. You want to put monitoring on everything, things like Nagios, Monet, technologies like OpenFlow to monitor all TCP connections and the amount of data flowing through different TCP ports and where that data is going, to log analysis, analysis of all your system and network logs, and bandwidth and account activity. Bandwidth is a really critical one most people, I think, forget because they don't realize how much information is available in bandwidth. But OpenFlow and bandwidth are 2 of the most obvious places to discover that you've been hacked. So when you're using statistics and metrics to catch potential problems, a bandwidth usage abnormality, that's possible exfiltration. That could be your database flowing out of your company. A lot of companies, when they reach, say, a small to medium size, that can take as long as a week for an entire database to exit a company. So there is a possibility if you put these metrics in place, you'll be able to catch a hack while it's happening or when it first starts and prevent a lot of the damage that can be done. Disk I/O abnormality. This could be ransomware encrypting all your files. So monitoring all the aspects of your hardware is very important. And setting alarms that go off when things are standard deviations away from where they normally are, or at least when they reach percentages that are very high in terms of total capacity of what your hardware can do. Unusual traffic from certain IPs could be botnet activity. Or someone's penetrated your system and using it to attack other systems. Unusual account activities, logins from places you don't recognize or that really shouldn't be logging in. Possible employee account compromise, or an employee who's doing something that they shouldn't be doing. So all of these systems come together to kind of provide a barrier of proof of work. Like I said, the NSA is not an adversary that you'll likely be able to prevent from accessing your systems and your data. But what you want to do is, even if they can break cryptographic systems, and cryptographic systems will eventually be broken. We've seen this time and time again. You can go back and find an old book that talks about implementing cryptography in the 1990s, and they'll say things like, RC4 would take longer than the number of years if every atom in the universe was counted as a year, right? It takes trillions, quadrillions of years to hack this hash algorithm. And a lot of that stuff right now can be done in 15 minutes, 20 minutes with modern hardware. So it's very hard to predict how long cryptographic algorithms will stay safe. But right now, at least, if you use modern cryptography and you use it properly, you're creating a barrier to hackers and a barrier to government organizations that they have to step over. So while they may not be willing to do the work to go to court and get a warrant, you can force them to at least be sure enough about the person that they're going to analyze and whose data they're going to steal, that that particular person is involved in something where it's worthwhile for them to do that. So, you know, are crypto systems already broken? Historically, this has been the case. Again, the poison nut system with Diffie-Hellman. It's likely that a lot of the cryptography that we are using is broken, but it's likely not broken to the point where it's instantaneous to decrypt data that's encrypted. It likely takes some amount of work, some amount of resources. For example, for one individual, if they have PGP encryption, it may cost several $1 million to decrypt that for the NSA. So we just want to put that little disincentive there so that they're not putting a dragnet out there on everyone. They're just targeting people who are likely involved in activities where they should be targeted. Okay. The idea is not to stop hackers, but to try and put that barrier in place. So DDoS attacks. Attacks have become large enough to knock entire countries offline for extended periods. You're going to need to use an upstream provider that's doing BGP-type filtering. AWS is doing that right now, but be careful when you deploy systems and infrastructure inside Ukraine. Famously, ProtonMail got hit with a DDoS that knocked most of Switzerland offline for 3 days. So DDoS attacks are becoming a huge problem, and frequently there's distraction from other attacks. So what startup revenue models are out there? There are alternatives to AdRev. The big question I had when I started working with ProtonMail and saw companies like it is, have these revelations changed what is possible in terms of business models? And I think ProtonMail has proven that yes, they have. People are willing to pay to keep their privacy, either on a monthly model or a research uses model. And AdRev might come back in an alternative form where it's just broad, where it's no longer targeted by deep data. It's just pay-per-click, pay-per-action, and it's like TV advertising or radio advertising years ago. Will these things work for Ukrainian startups? Most Ukrainian startups and startups that I found in Europe are based on, this is company X for country Y or language Y. You know, Yandex is Google for Russia. Current incentives around this are like ease of use and cultural fit, but building companies and products that offer security is something that American companies are not doing, and they cannot do because the ecosystem in the US will not support it. So if you build a company in Ukraine that's based on this kind of security, where the end user is in charge of their own data, I think it's a possible way to provide a good enough incentive that it'll break out of the Ukrainian geography and become a worldwide company. And local laws may be used for arbitrage like we did with Switzerland. So in summary, end-to-end encryption if all possible in all your systems. You know, always store data encrypted, but at least do client-side encryption if you can't do end-to-end encryption. And use decentralized ephemeral keys and primitive to avoid things like the poison nut Diffie-Hellman attack. Data retention, see it as a risk rather than a potential reward. Data shouldn't be something you want to sell, it's something you should protect on behalf of your customer. And auto expiration and auto wipe of data, like text messages, personal messages, there's a huge demand for that, and it's just the right thing to do in terms of maintaining people's privacy. There's no way that, say, a border guard or a hacker should be able to go and see 20 years of conversations between you and your wife. And this cultural change is already happening where people are shifting to privacy. So I think if you get out in front of it, you can see it and really take off. So any questions, please feel free to email me.